What if one of the most important materials in the entire nuclear balance is not plutonium, not uranium, and not some futuristic breakthrough, but a radioactive gas so scarce that the world's civilian supply would fit in a duffel bag? Because that is the real story of tritium. It is small, it is obscure, most people never think about it. And yet modern nuclear arsenals depend on it in a very uncomfortable way. It decays fast, it has to be replenished, and without a steady supply, even a superpower's nuclear stockpile gradually loses performance and flexibility over time. That is why this is not just a science story. It is an industrial story, a deterrence story, and increasingly, a geopolitical story. In other words, tritium is one of those materials that almost never makes headlines until the moment policymakers realize they cannot do without it. And right now, that realization is becoming much harder to ignore. In January 2026, the U.S. National Nuclear Security Administration announced a record 13 tritium extractions in just 9 months, an unusually public sign that Washington is moving with new urgency on a problem that used to sit quietly in the background. To understand why that matters, we have to start with what tritium is and what it is not. Tritium is hydrogen-3, a radioactive isotope of hydrogen. In nuclear weapons, its critical role is not that it replaces plutonium or uranium. It does not. Its role is to boost the yield of a fission primary, the part of the weapon that initiates the larger thermonuclear process in a modern two-stage design. SIPRI notes that tritium is used by most of the major nuclear weapon states for exactly this boosting function, and that without it, modern boosted weapons lose much of the performance that makes them militarily relevant. And here is the catch: tritium is useful, but it is fragile. Its half-life is about 3 years. That means it does not just sit in storage forever waiting patiently to be used. It shrinks. It decays. NNSA says active warheads must be continually replenished to maintain stockpile integrity, while SIPRI notes that half of a given amount disappears in just over 12 years. So unlike fissile material, tritium turns nuclear deterrence into a recurring industrial problem. You do not solve it once. You solve it again and again. That is why Audrey Beldio's War on the Rocks article makes such a strong point: tritium is the seemingly inconsequential item upon which everything else depends. That line is dramatic, but it is not hype. If the United States wants a credible, modern, maintained arsenal, it cannot just debate doctrine. It has to keep producing and recycling tritium. Strategy, in this case, sits on top of chemistry, reactor operations, extraction capacity, and fuel supply. During the Cold War, the United States had a much more straightforward answer to this problem: dedicated production reactors at the Savannah River site in South Carolina. Tritium production for weapons began there in the 1950s, and for decades that system worked as part of the broader Cold War nuclear enterprise. But by the late 1980s, the last of those reactors had shut down, leaving the United States without a dedicated tritium production reactor. For a period after that, stockpile needs were met largely by harvesting tritium from dismantled weapons. That bought time. It did not solve the long-term problem. And that transition matters because it reveals something bigger about post-Cold War America. Washington reduced or shut down many industrial capabilities that had been built for a different era. That made sense politically and economically at the time. But it also meant that, decades later, when strategic competition returned, the United States had to rediscover how to scale highly specialized defense production without simply rebuilding the Cold War model from scratch. Tritium is one of the clearest examples of that challenge. The American answer was unusual, and in its own way, elegant. Instead of building a new dedicated military reactor, the Department of Energy partnered with the Tennessee Valley Authority to use the Watts Bar civilian nuclear plant. The idea was to piggyback on commercial nuclear power generation by inserting tritium-producing burnable absorber rods, TPBARs, into the reactor core. Those rods use lithium to absorb neutrons, and the irradiation process breeds tritium. After the operating cycle, the irradiated rods are shipped to Savannah River, where the tritium is extracted, purified, and ultimately loaded into reservoirs for national security use. Watts Bar's 2 light water reactors also happen to provide electricity to roughly 1.3 million homes, which makes the whole arrangement even more striking: a civilian power plant contributing simultaneously to the civilian grid and the nuclear deterrent. This is the part of the story that makes the tritium issue so fascinating. The rods begin with design and materials work at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and testing support from Idaho National Laboratory, then move into a reactor system that was built first and foremost to generate power, not weapons material. That means the tritium mission has to coexist with the plant's commercial role. The engineering challenge is not just to make more tritium. It is to do so while preserving reactor safety, electricity output, and regulatory compliance. And over time, the United States got much better at it. The first Watts Bar tritium harvest in 2007 yielded only 223 grams. In 2015, DOE set a target of 2,800 grams across the two reactors in each rolling 18-month cycle by 2025. That target was later raised to 3,300 grams by 2027, and according to the March 2026 War on the Rocks article, engineering improvements allowed that level to be reached 2 years early, with an expected yield of roughly 3,400 grams in the next cycle and longer-term optimism that the two reactors might eventually reach as much as 5,800 grams per 18-month cycle. That is why the January 2026 NNSA announcement matters more than it might seem at first glance. A record 13 tritium extractions in 9 months is not just a production metric. It is a signal that the US nuclear enterprise is trying to build resilience and surge capacity into one of the most perishable parts of the stockpile. NNSA framed it explicitly as essential to the deterrent mission. In plain English, America is telling itself, and indirectly telling rivals, that it is taking the maintenance side of nuclear credibility seriously. Because deterrence is not only about how many warheads you have on paper. It is also about whether the industrial base underneath them is healthy enough to sustain, refuel, adapt, and expand if the strategic environment gets worse. The Federation of American Scientists estimates that the 9 nuclear-armed states still possessed about 12,321 warheads at the beginning of 2026, and that modernization trends are continuing across the major arsenals. In that kind of environment, a fragile support material like tritium stops being a technical footnote and becomes part of the strategic balance itself. Before we go further, if you value deep, evidence-based defense analysis like this, please hit like and subscribe. It really helps this channel keep doing serious research instead of surface-level reaction content. Thank you. Now, back to the analysis. One of the strongest points in the War on the Rocks article is that tritium production is not just a reactor story. It is a fuel sovereignty story. Reactor fuel used for US tritium production has to be unobligated, in other words, free from peaceful use restrictions tied to foreign partners. NNSA says it currently has sufficient low-enriched uranium for tritium production through the early to mid-2040s, but beyond that it needs a renewed domestic uranium enrichment capability. That is why the tritium story connects directly to the wider effort to rebuild parts of the American nuclear fuel cycle that were allowed to atrophy after the Cold War. That may sound bureaucratic, but strategically it is a big deal. If a country depends on foreign obligated material for a key element of deterrence, then supply chains become part of nuclear policy. The US view is clearly that this is unacceptable. So when Beldio argues that fuel policy is deterrence policy, that is not just rhetorical flourish. It reflects a very practical reality. Without domestic control over the fuel inputs for tritium production, Washington's nuclear options become more constrained in a crisis. Now zoom out beyond the United States. The global tritium picture is surprisingly tight. War on the Rocks and the Kleinman Center both note that the total civilian tritium stockpile is only around 25 kilograms. Most of that is tied to Canada, where CANDU heavy water reactors generate tritium as a byproduct. Kleinman notes that Canada's reactors together generate about 2 kilograms per year, while US production at Watts Bar is also on the order of roughly 2 kilograms annually, though dedicated to defense rather than civilian use. France has also moved in a direction that looks strikingly similar to the US model. In March 2024, Le Monde reported that France would use EDF Civos reactors to irradiate lithium-bearing materials for tritium production, with the new process expected to begin from 2025 after approvals. The report noted that France's earlier military production at Marcoule had ended in 2009. So here again, you see a nuclear power using civilian reactor infrastructure to support the maintenance of a strategic deterrent. On the civilian side, the IAEA's Fusion Conference materials noted that Canada and the Republic of Korea were actively extracting tritium from heavy water reactors, with Romania planning a removal facility as well. South Korea's Wolsong tritium removal infrastructure has been operating since 2007. Meanwhile, a Science Direct review noted that China produces a small quantity of tritium at Qinshan and is exploring alternative production methods. While India's heavy water reactor base gives it significant long-term potential if separation capacity and political conditions align. In other words, the tritium landscape is small, specialized, and concentrated in only a handful of countries. And now we get to the part that could make the tritium story even more intense in the future: fusion energy. Right now, tritium's main strategic role is still nuclear weapons. But if commercial fusion ever begins to scale seriously, demand could explode far beyond today's levels. The Kleinman Center notes that a single 1 gigawatt fusion reactor could require nearly 55 kilograms of tritium per year. Put that beside the roughly 25 kilograms of estimated civilian stock in the entire world, and the scale of the challenge becomes obvious immediately. Fusion's fuel problem is not deuterium. It is tritium. That does not mean fusion is about to compete directly with nuclear weapons programs tomorrow. but it does mean that tritium is becoming something more than a niche military material. The IAEA conference material warned that future commercially available tritium stocks could become insufficient for fusion demand, depending on reactor retirements and breeding technology progress. So the same isotope that already matters for deterrence could, over time, become a bottleneck for an entirely different strategic sector, advanced energy. And that is where the story becomes bigger than one weapons program. If tritium ends up sitting at the intersection of nuclear deterrence, domestic fuel sovereignty, reactor engineering, and future fusion economics, then whoever masters that supply chain gains more than just inventory stability. They gain options. And in strategic competition, options matter. So what is the real takeaway here? It is not that tritium alone decides the nuclear balance. Clearly it does not. Warheads, delivery systems, command and control, submarines, bombers, missiles, doctrine, and industrial scale all matter. But tritium is one of those hidden dependencies that reveals whether a nuclear arsenal is merely large or genuinely sustainable. That is why the United States is visibly trying to increase capacity now. It is why France is moving civilian reactor infrastructure into the problem. It is why fuel obligations matter. And it is why the tritium story tells us something larger about this era. The new arms race is not only about flashy delivery systems or public missile tests. It is also about obscure materials, regulatory approvals, enrichment capability, industrial continuity, and whether states can still do the hard, unglamorous work that keeps deterrence real. So yes, tritium is a tiny material. But strategically, it is a very large problem. If America can keep expanding production efficiently, securing unobligated fuel, and maintaining the extraction pipeline, then Washington preserves flexibility in a more dangerous nuclear environment. If it cannot, then policy ambitions eventually run into physical limits. And that may be the most important point of all. Nuclear credibility is not just about what leaders say. It is about whether the material base exists to support their choices. And before we close, if you enjoyed this kind of serious, research-driven military analysis, please hit like, subscribe, and leave your take in the comments. Does tritium deserve a much bigger place in the public debate about nuclear modernization, or will it stay one of those hidden issues that only specialists notice until it becomes a crisis? And one final note, the idea for this video was inspired by the article Quenching the Nuclear Stockpile's Thirst for Tritium, written by Audrey Beldio and published by War on the Rocks in March 2026. That article is worth reading, and it will be in the description alongside the rest of the research sources used for this script.